So like you saw in the last video, when fossil fuels, things like coal, natural gas, petroleum, when fossil fuels are burned for energy, when they're combusted, they release CO2. We saw last class that this CO2 gets into the atmosphere. So today we're going to talk more about the harms associated with CO2 getting into the atmosphere. But before we do, here's just a quick video clip showing you sources of CO2 that you might not otherwise think of.
Each one of these balloons represents 50 grams of greenhouse gas. You can't see it, but you produce greenhouse gas every time you use energy. The average home produces over 200,000 balloons every year. Save energy, and you'll also save money and reduce your impact on climate change. You have the power to make a difference.
So like we saw in the last video, when you combust a hydrocarbon, the products are CO2, carbon dioxide, and water. So we've been saying that CO2 contributes to global warming. Now let's see how that happened. So CO2 is just one of the gases that is in the atmosphere. You did the pie charts on the table. You saw that nitrogen is the largest, followed by oxygen. But then in the smallest little piece of the pie, there were trace gases. These trace gases can include things like sulfur dioxide, SO2, nitrogen oxide, which is NO, and again, CO2, carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, carbon dioxide is taking up a bigger piece of the pie lately. So here's a graphic to show you how CO2 and these other acidic greenhouse gases get into the air. So it starts by burning, by combusting. So this is a power plant, but it could also be a picture of your car, a picture of your furnace to heat your house. Whatever you're combusting though, the smoke goes into the air. So the smoke is what contains these gases. Those gases go up into the atmosphere, into the air. They're carried by the wind. And then in some cases, they get dissolved into rainwater, which is something that causes acid rain. We're not going to talk too much about acid rain right now, but what I really want you to get out of this picture is the fact that when fossil fuels are burned, they release gases. These gases are bad. So really quickly, the atmosphere is just a blanket of gases that surround the Earth. So it's like a layer that protects us. So it keeps us from getting too hot or too cold. It's kind of like Goldilocks. It's just right. And it's why humans are only able to live on Earth right now. Mars doesn't have an atmosphere, which is why it gets so drastically hot and so drastically cold. Or Mercury, it's like a shriveled little ball because it doesn't have any atmosphere, nothing to protect itself from the heat of the sun. So the gases in our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen with oxygen as well. So some of the other gases like CO2 and water exist naturally. Here's just a picture, nothing too special here. There's layers to the atmosphere. I don't want you to worry too much about this. Just know that the troposphere is mostly what we're talking about here because that's the part where we mostly live in. So the problem with CO2 gases is when they're emitted, they get trapped by our atmosphere, and this contributes to what we call the greenhouse effect. So here's a picture of the greenhouse effect. So we need some sunlight to be able to keep a normal temperature. But the problem is that CO2 and other gases are trapping more heat, making the earth warmer than we want. So it's good to get some heat trapped, but there's so much CO2 that more heat keeps getting trapped. So here's a quick summary of how combustion, the greenhouse effect, and global warming are related. So first, CO2 is released into the atmosphere by the combustion of hydrocarbons in fossil fuels. So burning these fossil fuels makes the CO2 get into the air. Second step is this CO2 then gets trapped by the atmosphere. CO2 then absorbs heat from the sun and it acts like a greenhouse. So the CO2 is kind of like an extra layer, an extra blanket. So it keeps making things hotter because it keeps absorbing the heat. So because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere now, more heat is able to get trapped by the CO2. Because of this, global temperatures are rising, which is called global warming. So combustion puts the CO2 in the air. The CO2 in the air then traps the heat like a greenhouse. And then because it's acting like a greenhouse now, we're seeing global warming trends.